Today on the 01581 Let's Talk, a conversation with Senator Michael Moore. Hello.
Hello.
Welcome back.
Thank you. It's nice to be here again.
Yeah, this is great. It's becoming a tradition.
Yes, and it's actually it's a great time of year. The weather's beautiful, so
I know. I like you got your like spring suit on. Like it? Nice.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thanks. Yeah. After last weekend, I thought it was supposed to be nice and it was a little chillier, and I was like, well, let's get into the whole spring summer mode.
It's going to be a beautiful week.
Yes.
So excellent, excellent. Well, today we're going to talk about numbers, the budget.
Fun stuff.
Yeah, I know. So let's kind of get into what you want to get into. Let's talk about kind of the supplemental budget. And I think I would love for viewers to have a better understanding of like what is the process, right?
Okay.
So how do proposed budgets become like the actual?
Okay.
And
so
take it away.
Okay. So now there's the supplemental budget, and then there's actually legislation.
Okay.
So the supplemental budget, because it's what's classified as a money bill,
Okay.
has to originate in the House of Representatives.
Okay.
So similar to the governor's tax proposal that she filed, because it's a money bill and actually creates a tax increase or a tax cut, which this bill does, tax reform, it has to originate in the House.
Okay.
We cannot in the Senate initiate, based on the Constitution, we cannot initiate that. Now, say you had, say the governor was proposing a reform on higher education. Mm-hmm. The administration can file a piece of legislation in the House or the Senate.
Okay.
So that can go either way.
Okay.
So a supplemental budget, because it's a money bill, has to start in the House.
Got it.
So from the House, it will get released.
Yep.
They'll get debated. Get released. The House of Representatives has to have a chance to file amendments, and then they debate it. Then after they debate it, then it goes to the Senate.
Okay.
It will go to Senate Ways and Means. Senate Ways and Means will then look at the budget, see what we agree with, what we don't agree with, and they'll release the bill to the Senate for us to debate.
Okay.
And again, we will get time from the period they release it until the debate to file amendments.
And what is the period of time usually? So from that release point to the larger House or Senate?
It varies.
Okay.
You could have a supplemental budget. They could give you a week.
Okay.
They could give you 2 days. And it really depends on the legislation. So here's an example. The House is releasing their fiscal budget for 2024. I think they get releasing it tomorrow.
Okay.
And I think they have until 5 o'clock Friday to file their amendments. But then they have then House Ways and Means has a whole week
Okay.
that they'll go through all the amendments.
Okay.
Now, because you'll have hundreds of amendments that are filed.
Sure.
And then they debate it. So we'll get it. So we will get the budget, and Senate Ways and Means will release it. I'm going to say maybe the end of the second week of May or the beginning of the third week.
Okay.
We will now they could give us 2 or 3 days. They
Right
could give us 4
near
days.
Memorial Day, perfect time.
Well, so basically, yes, actually it is perfect time, because what they'll do is they'll give us a few days to file amendments. Now, most of us will have an idea. So when the House sends out a budget, right?
There's visibility to that process.
Right, and we'll get contacted by whether it's state agency, advocates, or just issues that we know we're paying attention to.
Sure.
So we'll have an idea that, okay, if the Senate doesn't match this number or come higher, I've got this amendment ready.
I got
so
it. Okay.
we have a little more opportunity than the House does, the House Representatives. We will debate the budget the last week of May. So basically what they do, they really put the pressure on us that if we want to stay in for Friday, Saturday, we usually pretty much, maybe Friday morning we've gone in.
There's an incentive to move the discussion along.
To move it along, so we're done by Memorial Day weekend.
Interesting.
And then from that point, the House and the Senate, this goes to any bill. When there's a difference between the legislation, it goes to a conference committee.
Okay.
Now, the conference committee then it will be 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and they will negotiate out.
And are those the highest ranking individuals?
So what you'll have is a representative from the Senate President's office.
Okay.
And you'll have, if it's the budget, you're going to have someone from Ways and Means, usually the chair
Yep.
of both branches, the House and the Senate chair.
Yep.
Then you'll have a representative from the Minority Leader's office.
Okay.
And then you'll have a designee from the Senate President's office.
Interesting.
So that's who
And
goes
they're
to
there to
conference.
basically kind of hash out the
Yeah, they sit down.
differences.
You want to give $100 million to hire it. I want to give 50, but you want to give
Yep.
$100 million to some other issue, and then we'll give you that. You give us this.
And is it common that money bills get to that level? Is that,
Oh, yeah,
that's
yeah.
routine?
Oh yeah, it's
really?
huge.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
very
yeah.
seldom you get a bill.
Yeah, like everyone's happy.
Yeah. Now you may have a smaller bill.
Sure.
When I say something outside the budget, you may have another bill that you may have one or two sections that the language may be similar, or there may be some small differences. When the bill goes, when there's a difference between the bills, rather than creating a conference committee,
Yep.
the Senate President in the Speaker's office, they may sit and say, or their representatives sit and say, look, okay, let's work this out. Rather, because a conference committee, you got to vote on a conference committee, you got to establish
Yeah,
it.
it's a whole process
Right.
in and of itself.
So if it's
right?
minor changes, then
Yeah.
they can do that.
Yeah, got it.
So,
Okay.
so this even goes back to so when the budget gets finalized,
Mm-hmm.
and this goes to a supplemental budget also. When it gets finalized, the governor then gets 10 days to go through it and administer any line item vetoes.
Okay.
So that's an authority that the governor has that the president doesn't have when the budget comes through a legislation.
Sure.
Based on the line item vetoes, we then have an opportunity, the legislature, if we want to override,
Yep.
and 90% of the time,
Yep.
because you have a budget that's, I should say 99% of the time, because
Yep.
you've had a budget, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, doesn't matter, the legislature will, because you've had the House and Senate negotiate out a budget,
Right.
and the governor's saying
No.
It's
Yep.
like, well, look, this is our budget. We think there's enough,
Yep.
unless there's a really, really good justification for
Sure.
it. We will do overrides.
Okay.
Now, again, based on the Constitution,
Yep.
you could have the Senate, you could see us wanting to override every line item, and every line
That's
item
been
veto.
vetoed, yep.
If the House doesn't send it to us, we can't do it. The House has to initiate.
They're the
line.
gatekeepers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is where you have the you have the separation of powers.
Yeah.
So and it has worked out well. I mean, it forces negotiation. It forces
Yep.
people to compromise.
Yep.
So
I love that word, compromise.
compromise.
It's important. Yeah. No, it's
getting-
important. It's part of our process. And I really appreciate, and I'm sure our viewers do as well, kind of the civics lesson here, because I think that it's a big soup for many people, so appreciate that.
Yeah, and sometimes people forget too, is when we do legislation, not really the budget, but sometimes in budget you'll have policy sections. When we pass legislation about, we could be reforming domestic violence legislation or something. We pass the framework
Yeah.
and the concepts, and many times we will then empower the state agency
Yeah.
to establish regulations,
Yes.
because they forget we don't run the day-to-day.
Right.
The governor's
Yeah.
office, they come
Yeah.
in, they run the day-to-day, and a lot of times people will call us up and say, hey, this agency's doing this.
Yeah.
It's like, well, look, we'd love to help or reach out to them,
Yeah.
but we don't have the authority to say, no, you
Yeah.
can't do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting sometimes because I've been on the other side of some of those conversations back in my kind of business professional days,
Yep.
where I've been candidly pretty frustrated. Like, okay, we passed this overarching like policy, this legislation, right? Or we created this policy, and then someone else implemented it, and there is a disconnect, and it's because it's kind of like it's being managed day to day over here, and it has. My view, it's been perceived sometimes as like, what the heck? How can you implement something? How can you create the framework and not, be involved in the nuts and bolts? But that is the purpose of the state agencies.
And you think about it, and this is what people have to remember too, is there's 6,000 bills filed.
Yeah.
And it takes, we pass maybe 200 to 300,
Sure.
maybe 400
Yeah.
bills a
Yeah.
session, depends on the session, what's going on.
Sure.
You would not want us passing 6,000 pieces of legislation.
No, you're right.
And you would not want
Yeah.
us to do the regulation,
Right.
because it can take a piece of, even what someone would call a no-brainer,
Yeah.
that can take 4 years to pass.
Sure.
6
Yeah.
years.
Well, and you're at your position are at the will of the voters, and
Yeah.
there's turnover. No, it makes perfect sense from the from the outside view. Sometimes it's kind of like, oh my gosh, you implemented a policy that's it doesn't have a framework underneath it, or the details underneath it.
So just so, and also, so people realize when the state agency does regulations, many times rather than file legislation on an issue that we think may need to be corrected,
Yep.
we will, and myself and I know other legislators, will reach out to the state agency, we'll find out if there's a regulation.
Yeah.
And a regulation can be changed upon the state agency having public hearings.
Right.
So it's
There is an opportunity for input, absolutely,
right.
yeah.
But
yeah.
it's quicker and easier.
Yeah.
So this is why you'll see us many times, like you'll see a legislator sometimes, and I've done it, I'll file legislation on an issue. And in all honesty, I'll use that legislation as leverage to go to the state agency and say, look, this is the issue we're having. If you don't help us and address this problem,
Yeah.
I'm going to push the legislation.
Gotcha.
So rather than doing that,
That's love the insight, because again, I just think that folks don't understand that, right? I mean, it's unless you're living it day to day.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this is where I know people about term limits and all that. This is just like any other profession.
Sure.
The more experience you have, the more knowledge of it you have, the more successful you can be at it because you know how it works.
Right.
And I always kind of laugh that this is the only profession that the more experience you have in any profession, usually it makes you more valuable to that organization.
Sure.
Or this is the only one.
We have
that people-
institutional knowledge,
But
right?
this is the only one that people are like, oh no, you've been there too long.
Yeah. Well, I think when I don't know.
Yeah.
We'll have another conversation about that some other day. Okay, so let's talk about some of the we've got bonding. Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah,
so you
go
said
ahead.
the SNAP, the supplemental budget. So
Yes.
the one that was signed by the governor.
Yep.
Everyone knows that the SNAP, which is the food assistance,
Yep.
The federal government, the pandemic area relief
Right.
is going away.
Yep.
Actually, it's gone now.
Yes.
By the time of the show, so we are providing $130 million in SNAP assistance.
Yep.
This is only to reduce the burden of people who are losing it.
Yep.
So I think we're providing 40% of what they were offered.
Okay. Yep.
So this is going to like a little step down.
Yep.
So it's
Sure.
just not all of a sudden gone.
Right. There's not a cliff. There's just
Yep.
a
It's
slow
just
hill.
a slow hill.
Yep. Got it. Okay.
Then we have $65 million for the continuation of the free meals.
Okay. Yep.
Which has been a very successful program.
Absolutely.
Then we have $45 million for the emergency shelter program, and then $40 million for the supportive affordable housing for immigrants and refugees.
Sure.
So this is actually two that kind of relate to Westboro.
Absolutely.
Because we have the emergency housing going on at the shack.
Absolutely.
shack
And so
building.
that's where we'd see some support from at the state level.
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
Yep.
So some of your costs that you're incurring as far as buses
Yep.
and any like public safety types of things.
Sure.
So there should be available funds to help the impact that the communities are feeling. Sure.
And is that ultimately distributed to the communities based on a formula, or is it does Westboro need to like apply for that assistance?
I think Westboro shouldn't have to apply because they're already dealing with
Yep.
DHCD. But if they have to do some sort of formal application,
Sure.
we can help out with that. I don't think they have to, but
Okay.
we
Okay.
can find out with
Got
that.
it. Okay.
Then the other one is a $740 million in bonding. This is part of this is projects that we had looked at back in last July
Yep.
that we never got through because
Okay.
the bill never came out of conference committee, the economic development bill. So with this, so part of this
Is
does.
this PFAS
well-
included here, or is that separate?
That's separate. So,
Okay, wow.
this
Wow.
is clean water infrastructure.
Yep. Okay.
So there's bonding capability for that and other public works projects. But there's also, back in July, the federal government passed the CHIPS Act.
Yep. Yeah,
And
you
this is
talked
where,
about that.
so this is where they're trying to establish chip manufacturing or microprocessing
Yep.
here in the country.
Okay.
Because we've seen during the pandemic that our cost, the supply chain issue we had,
Yeah.
and that we have an over-reliance on other countries
Sure.
on this. So we're trying to build it there. So I was actually able to get $10 million in the bond bill
Yep.
that never went forward.
Sure.
So the administration actually put forth $200 million
Yep.
for this, as part of this bill.
Okay.
This overall
so
bill is
part
$740.
part of that 700
is $125 million that's going to try to incentivize the implementation of a semiconductor chip manufacturing economy here in
great.
Massachusetts.
Excellent.
So,
Excellent. Okay. And the let's talk about kind of what you mentioned pre-pandemic. So one of the bills also addresses outdoor dining. So
Yes.
that's been very popular
Yep.
here in Westboro and surrounding communities. So that's been extended?
It's been extended. That and also the remote purchase of liquor.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
that's been extended. And
So like the kind of cocktails to go.
cocktails to go.
Yeah,
That's that's actually
Yeah.
So that actually was more of the I think more of the controversial.
Yeah, there was a discrepancy, right, between the House and the Senate
Yeah.
as part of that?
Well, yeah, and just as far as whether we should do it or not.
Like, is it kind of the right thing to do, meaning,
kind of-
given
yeah.
our kind of, drunk driving and other,
And that's just what some of the arguments, though. We
Sure.
had the package store
Sure.
industry coming in, talking about those
Yeah.
effects.
Yeah.
Yet we really haven't seen
Right.
that from law enforcement.
Right.
And in the package store industry, actually during the pandemic, was one of the few, I shouldn't say few, I guess there were several, but
That
they
actually
did,
flourished?
They
Yeah.
did flourish during the pandemic. So the cocktails to go actually
Sure.
helped a lot of the restaurants.
Sure.
So only doing a limited extension
Yeah.
kind of gives us a little bit more opportunity to value, to make an evaluation of what we think
Sure.
of this. The outdoor dining part of it, to me, I think that's great up. I think
it's
that's
a
great.
no-brainer, honestly.
Well, you
think-
say that, but we have a lot of municipalities before this and after
Oh, yeah.
that, think about it, when you travel somewhere on vacation, you look for locations
Yeah,
like that.
right?
And then I even started in my hometown when I was on the Board of Selectmen.
Sure.
We had a restaurant that wanted to
Yeah.
put some outdoor dining in, and people complained, and it's like,
Yeah.
why would you oppose this?
Right, yeah, because when you go on vacation, you look for those
That's
places.
what you look for. You sit outside, some
right.
place to enjoy.
Yeah.
So,
right.
so now it gives us a little bit more time, and the municipality a little bit more time to hopefully evaluate the impact of it outside of the pandemic now.
Okay, yeah.
So
Yeah,
we'll see.
yeah.
Then
And so, I guess the two tracks it could follow, right? It could follow on a temporary course year over year,
Yep.
but to make it permanent, it would actually have to be legislation.
yes,
Is that
and-
correct?
yeah. So basically, because we've got it now sunsetting in 2 years,
Yeah.
we will have to go back and revisit the issue.
Gotcha.
And at that point, we can look at now
have some data
in
around
the
it,
so-called
yeah.
normal economy.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
What was the impact?
Sure.
Did it actually help out? Did it hurt?
Sure.
And we can assess all this thing.
Sure.
I know a lot of people don't think that we use data, but sometimes we do.
Yeah.
We do use this information.
Sure, yeah. Well,
So-
and you need some experience. That makes sense. Okay, so let's talk about the governor's tax reform proposal.
Yes.
So, a topic near and dear to your heart and interest. You're interested in tax reform, right?
Yeah.
You've
Oh,
been
yeah.
working toward it for a while.
I think that when I go back to from personal to commercial. I grew up with my father when I was growing up, had a restaurant, operated a restaurant, a wallpaper store, a hardware store. So from the small business end of it,
Yeah.
I can see some of the impact he had.
Yep.
And actually, he was actually one of the first ones. Not to go back to my childhood,
Yeah,
but. When I was growing up, my father had a hardware store, and he actually got arrested on a Sunday morning because he violated the blue laws.
Oh, jeez.
And he took it to court, and actually the attorney that represented him was attorney Mel Greenberg.
Yeah.
He ended up becoming a judge. He actually won and beat overturned some of the blue laws.
Wow, no kidding.
Yeah, so
Wow.
what it was, he had a hardware store.
Sure.
The hardware store across the street from him was selling milk and some dairy products and bread.
Sure.
He wasn't.
Gotcha.
The other store could stay open, he couldn't.
Oh,
So he
interesting.
continued to open, and they
Yep.
came in. And when I first got elected, I was chair of the Small Business Community Development,
Mm-hmm.
and seeing the impact, I never realized it until I got in office, that 86% of the economy is small business. So any sort of tax relief we can try to provide
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
for our small businesses and their owners,
Yep.
it's only going to help the general overall economy and
Right.
the quality of life for people and provide more job opportunities.
Right.
So I'm really happy to see that the governor
Yep.
is doing this,
Great.
especially with especially with the cost of living that people
Sure.
experience right now.
Sure.
Any sort of relief
Yep.
that we can provide every sector of our
Sure.
economy. Look, we always got to look out for the low income and
Mm-hmm.
the underserved population. A lot of times it's
What's the middle? Often it's not. I mean, there are a lot, maybe not enough, but a lot of supports for low.
right.
Right.
And then when the big tax break comes, it affects the more
Right.
more
right.
affluent.
But it's that huge increasing middle, whatever the middle is anymore.
that bears the brunt of
Right,
bears the brunt of it. So
right.
so I think looking at some of the tax proposal here, especially now,
Sure.
it actually is going to affect or help every segment that we have of this.
So we know there's a child and family tax credit that's been proposed, but the one I want to focus on is for viewers here in Westboro, the rent tax deduction is
Yes.
kind of an interesting one. We have a fairly high percentage relative to surrounding communities of rental properties here.
Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about that, what's proposed?
So the governor would allow renters to deduct up to $4,000 on what they pay in rent, which is up from $3,000 now.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, there's a lot of people that don't even know they have this rental deduction.
right.
So so in some ways, maybe this is something we should look at also, is trying to get
Like,
the
how
state to
many
market it
right,
out
exactly,
there.
yeah, yeah.
That's one thing I found since being in office, that a lot of times the state has programs, the state has ways of helping people
Yeah.
that people just don't know
Just
about.
don't- yeah, yeah.
So it's going up from 3,000 to 4,000. It's estimated to help 880,000 taxpayers,
Yeah.
and it's going to cost the state about $40 million.
Sure, okay.
Which and this would double the maximum credit for low-income seniors that they can claim to offset their property taxes from
Which is-
$1,200 to $2,400.
Which is a big deal, because we
Yes.
hear that all the time from seniors saying, I love living in Westboro. I understand my home is my biggest asset, but it doesn't help me until I sell it, and you're
Yeah.
killing me with the property taxes. So this
Yeah.
is an opportunity.
Well, and that's, you look back to, not to get off the topic, you look back to what the 2.5 went through, and I think I was graduating high school, just after I graduated high school, and 2.5 went through, cities and towns had to slash services
Sure.
to come within compliance.
Yep.
But we're getting to a point now, even with 2.5,
Yeah.
the costs
Yeah.
of property tax,
Absolutely.
it's getting higher, and it's harder for people to
Yeah.
really bear the burden of that.
You have to stay. We have a higher exit rate than we do an entry rate. And
Yeah.
I know that you and the governor are very much aware of that. So one of the other interesting elements of the tax reform proposal is two things I want to talk about: short-term capital gains
Yes.
tax and estate tax.
Yep.
So. The short-term capital gains tax credit is on investments, but we were talking before we taped the show,
Yeah.
just to understand, what does that term investment mean?
Well, so right
What's it
now,
targeted at?
right? So it's targeting at like stocks, trading. I guess detecting words, commodities.
Sure.
Those
So
types
it's not like personal property.
Correct.
This particular element has nothing to do with when I sell my home and capital gains.
Correct.
Got it.
Yep. It
Okay.
has nothing to do with that.
Okay.
And I know one of the concerns you had was the effect on the budget.
Yep.
Especially with the fair share going in.
Right.
So basically, going back to many years before I was even in office, one of the recessions that the state had is when the market collapsed, and at that point the state was relying on a lot of money from the capital gains.
Sure.
So what they did at that point, and I think it was Representative Finneran and I'm forgetting who the Senate Ways and Means was, but Finneran was chairman of Ways and Means. They as a change to the process, capital gains could own from the sale of stocks and those commodities can only be put into they can't be factored into the operating budget.
Okay.
They're deposited into the rainy day fund.
Well, that makes sense, because there is a volatility around
And
that,
that's
right?
just that if
Right?
we're depending on that.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's actually worked out pretty well.
Sure.
So right now the state, I think the last time we talked about it, we may have been at $7 billion. So we have one of the higher ones in the country. So it's only I think it's $117 million that it's going to cost us.
Yeah.
So right now with the rainy day fund the way it is,
There's a cushion there.
there's a cushion.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
Okay, and the estate tax, that's a big one.
Yes, the estate tax, and actually this is higher than when we did the economic development bill last summer. The Senate was actually proposing to increase it from $1 million, to the deduction from $1 million to $2 million.
Yep.
So the governor has now come up with $3 million.
Yep.
So
Was that a surprise? Do you think?
kind of,
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
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 Now I don't know if they did it as a bargaining
Sure,
point.
sure.
Figuring if they started
Well, you
off at 2.
Right, we might end up at, yeah. We
at
start at
2.
3, we might end up at 2, and everyone's happy. Yeah.
And we're going to find out, as you and I were talking earlier, the House is releasing their tax. They're debating their tax proposal Thursday.
Sure.
So they're putting out some of their their changes that they want to make. So we don't even know if the House is what their position is
Right.
on this or the capital gains.
So they, just again, process-wise, so they, obviously everyone has visibility to this, this has been published, so I would assume that what they then present to the House and to the decision makers, if you will somehow evaluate or be responsive to what the governor has proposed.
It could, or they just don't include it. So this is where a lot.
Gotcha. Okay.
And again, it doesn't matter whether the administration is Democrat,
Yep.
Republican, and with a Democratic legislature.
Sure.
If you look back to even when Patrick, so I'm basing it on my years
Yep.
since Patrick's been, no matter which party's in the corner office,
Yep.
when the House or the Senate get that,
Yep.
yeah, they'll look at the governor's budget,
Sure. But-
and we'll look at the governors in the House.
Yep, yep.
And we do our thing.
Yeah, right.
Sometimes we won't even address it. You
Interesting.
may have something in the House and the governors that we won't even touch.
Yeah.
And then vice versa.
Yeah.
The House may neglect it, and we'll put it in, and then it becomes part of the negotiations.
Interesting. Wow. Day in a life. I love it.
So
Okay.
so
Yep,
that would
yep.
cost the state this year 165 million.
Yep.
In fiscal year 2024, it would cost the state 275 million.
Yeah, and just so viewers, so what the governor's proposed is eliminating tax on estates valued at $3 million or less
Yep.
by offering a tax credit up to $182,000.
Yes, yep.
So that will be interesting to watch that. Okay, Chapter 90, a favorite topic of folks here in Westboro. That's funding for our roads and kind of that sort of thing. I'm not going to hit you hard with this one, but folks have said, "Oh my God, the funding has remained consistent at $200 million across the Commonwealth,
Yep.
and everything has gone up." What's your thought on that?
I would love to see it go up to 300 million at least. Going back to, I was chair of the way a bond bill works.
Yep.
Administration files it. The House has a committee on bonding. Now we have joint committees.
Yep.
Bonding is one of the committees that we have standing committees.
Okay.
So that means there's a House committee on bonding. There are no senators on it, and the Senate has a committee on bonding. There are
Yep.
no House members on it.
I'm taking notes.
So I was actually chair, I think it was 5 years ago, of the committee on bonding, it's Senate committee.
Okay.
And at that point, I was trying to, and actually the chair of bonding before me, Senator Keenan, was trying to get $300 million. I followed through, and I was trying to get it. There was no support. We knew there was no support coming from the other branch, and honestly, there wasn't a lot of support in my branch for it, increasing it. But what they have done, I don't want to say as a compromise, but then you have seen this additional 150 million coming out now, dedicated for the small bridge programs
Yeah.
and those types of programs.
Yeah.
So in some ways, you can say, okay, yeah, we haven't increased the 200 million
Yeah.
for the Chapter 90.
Sure.
But some of those projects that would have been part of Chapter 90
Sure.
are now covered underneath this other program.
Okay.
And there's I think it was $150 million that has gone to that.
And but within that 150, as I understand it, there's a sub-allocation to specific areas, as opposed to it just being part of the general.
Right.
It's further sliced into other components as to how the money can be used.
Yes. So we get the 200 million for the general bond obligations.
Yep.
Then we have 150 million for bond obligations. Now this would be transportation development improvements. So
Sure.
what you're saying. So we have 25 million for the municipal bridge program.
Yep.
25 million for the complete streets program.
Yep.
25 million for the bus transit infrastructure. Then 25 million for grants to increase access to mass transit, commuter rail. 25 million for the electric vehicle grants, municipalities.
Yep.
25 million for road constructions for municipalities in low population density.
Sure.
I would say, now, I guess you could make the argument that even the electric vehicle grants and maybe the bus transit, maybe those wouldn't have been part of the Chapter 90, but the other programs
Sure.
probably would have fallen
Yeah.
underneath
Sure.
the 200 million.
Yeah.
But now, so in some ways, we didn't increase it 200 million,
Right.
but we've established this
Sure.
whole other 150 million, that there are projects that would have, you would have been, the cities and towns would have been forced to utilize
Sure.
to fund those.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think that I guess the other side of this is the separate bond create, and then its subcategories is what I'm referring to it as, also creates intentional spending, right?
Yes.
So some things that might have been overlooked, like the complete streets. I don't know. I'm just using it.
Yep.
Folks might say, well, do we really need? So it's dedicated to that. It's improving safe routes to school
Yes.
and not safe routes to school. Excuse me. Safer kind of communities and walkability and
And promoting, some communities use it for that. Some they want to make it
beautification.
Beautification.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
Bike ways.
Yeah.
So, and this goes to again on our end.
Yeah.
When we do this 200 million and it gets authorized to the cities and towns, there's nothing to say that right now that 200 million. That when the city or town gets that they have to spend it on roads,
Right.
they can spend it on equipment.
Right. Yeah.
So this does
Yep.
directs. Okay, if you want it, you've got to
Yep.
you've got to address the bridge in your community.
Absolutely.
You've got to address this
Sure,
issue.
sure.
So it does force the community in some ways to use the money for, I guess, what you want to say, the intended purpose.
Gotcha.
But I know, again, when I was on the board in Millbury, there were a couple of years that we needed to buy some new road equipment. So it's rather than spend some of the money on the roads,
Sure.
we purchased equipment that could be used by the
Right.
DPW to maintain the roads.
Right, exactly,
So-
exactly. Well, I know the select board will soon be discussing and having a presentation about our famous railroad bridge. So maybe there's an opportunity to use.
So what's now, you got, again, what's
Oh, the trucks getting stuck under the railroad bridge.
Oh, right down here on 30?
Yeah, oh, yeah, it's a favorite time. That's for another day. We don't have enough time, but more to come on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because you have to bring the rail company into that, don't you?
Oh yeah. It's there's no simple solution, but it's a pain point and a high interest point for our community. So
Yeah.
we'll be getting a presentation on it. So we'll stay in touch on that one. So
Okay.
all right. With that, thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the 01581 with Senator Michael Moore. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.